what is the spirit of the law? What's the difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law? Does the spirit of the law somehow spiritualize away the law? Does it mean that all you have to do is sort of think nice thoughts and you can do whatever you want to? What does it mean, the spirit of the law? The Bible, in the New Testament particularly, talks about the spirit of the law, and there's quite a bit that ties in with that relates very directly to the Christian life. It relates very directly and fundamentally to what it means to be a true Christian. But this is a concept that is not at all properly understood. It's not at all understood in the world around us. Society doesn't know. The world and the world's religions don't understand what is the spirit of the law, what's the difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and what is it that God expects of us. I would like for us this morning to focus in directly on an understanding of the spirit of the law. Now, in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we will pick it up in verse 6, because the Apostle Paul here begins to explain something that is crucial to understanding the spirit of the law. He speaks here of the fact, let's pick it up in verse 5. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. God, who has made us able ministers of the New Testament, has made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now what does that mean? God has made us ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter kills, the Spirit gives life. Well, let's go on. He says, if the administration of death, written and engraved in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? If the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more does the administration of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect by reason of the glory that excels. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remains is glorious. Seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. Not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished, but their minds were blinded. For until this day remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. We all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Now what is that talking about? Well, if you go back to the Old Testament, and I will recount it for you rather than turning back, you can go back to, in Exodus 19, of course, God proposed the Old Covenant with ancient Israel. He proposed to enter into a special covenant relationship, an agreement with ancient Israel. God would fulfill the role of husband, Israel would fulfill the role of wife. He would be the protector and the provider, Israel would be faithful to him. And the people said, all that the Lord has said, we will do. God then gave them the basic terms of the covenant, which were spoken by the mouth of God in Exodus 20, which were the Ten Commandments. Then Moses proceeded on to expound in Exodus 21, 22, 23, the statutes and judgments which were the application of the Ten Commandments to a physical people. If you go through Exodus 21, 22, and 23, you will find that one of the most frequently used words in those chapters is the little word, if. In fact, you might, sometimes you could just go through there and just note how that virtually every verse starts out if. Because the premise was God understood that He was dealing with a people that did not have a heart to obey. Oh, that there were such an heart in them that they would keep my commandments. God talked about that. Oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would keep my commandments. God gave them the commandments. And then Moses, inspired by God, proceeded to explain the application to a physical nation. What happens if somebody does this? Well, what happens if they do that? And what happens if this occurs? And what if this happens? And what if someone does this? So there were physical penalties that were to be administered. Because ancient Israel was not only a church, it was a civil nation. It was a state. And there was a need to enforce and administer certain principles of the law. And the key word there was if. If you do this, this is going to happen to you. If that occurs, if someone does this, this is the way you deal with it. And so we went through the statutes and the judgments with penalties attached, dealing with the application of the law to a people that really did not have a heart of obedience. But if this was going to be the law under which they would live, there had to be some enforcement provisions. Then Moses went up into the mountain, and he spent 40 days communing with God. And you remember the story. Afterward, he came back down, and they had broken they built the golden calf, and they were having a real orgy. Moses smashed the tables of stone and dealt with the leaders, the ringleaders of this, called for the Levites to execute the ringleaders that had stirred up this thing. After then dealing with them, he went back up the mountain because now the tables of stone were broken. Went back up the mountain. Spent another 40 days in the presence of God. When Moses finally came down the mountain, we're told that his face shined. Having been in the presence of God, that his face shined with such brilliance, with such glory, that the Israelites were unable to look on Moses' face. It was of such note that in fact, we're told that. See back in Exodus chapter 34. Exodus 34:28. He was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water. And he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. And it came to pass when Moses came down from the mountain with the two tables of testimony in Moses' hand, when he came down from the mount, that Moses did not realize that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. When Moses came down, his face was literally shining. And when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. He was glowing, and it scared them. Now you can imagine, somebody comes down, and it's like their face is shining. It's like you're looking at a light. And there's this glow. And Moses called unto them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them, and afterward all the children of Israel came near. And he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken. And until Moses had done speaking with them, he put a veil on his face. People were so intimidated by it, and were so, it was, in one sense, such a distraction to them, and they were so intimidated by it that Moses actually veiled his face. And when Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he took the veil off until he came out. And he came out and he spoke with the children of Israel that which was commanded. And the children of Israel saw the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses shone, his face shone. And Moses put the veil upon his face again until he went in to speak with the Lord. And this went on for a period of time, and gradually, over a period of days, the glow faded. Until finally, Moses' face returned to normal. Now, this was a miracle that took place. God dealt with Moses in a very special way. Moses was here in the very presence of God for a period of 40 days. This was the second 40-day period that he was there in God's presence. And God gave him the instructions that are the 10 Commandments, the statutes, the judgments, the basis of really the entire first 5 books of the Bible. The basis of the old covenant that God made with the children of Israel. Now, the old covenant, let's go back to Jeremiah chapter 31. Because you see, even in the time of the Old Testament, there was a prophecy that there would come something new. Jeremiah 31:31. Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband to them. God says, I fulfill my part. I made a covenant. They broke the covenant. I'm going to make a new covenant. Not identical to the one I made. Because the one I made, they broke. I'm going to make a new one. This shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they will be my people. Under the old covenant, the law was externally inscribed and written. It was written with the finger of God on tables of stone. It was written down by Moses with pen and ink on papyrus or vellum. It was written down as an external code that was externally enforced. The Levites were commissioned to enforce the law. And if people broke the law, they were dealt with, including the death penalty, which was exacted. Because God was dealing with a physical nation. Now, the Apostle Paul brings out in 2 Corinthians 3, referring to himself as a minister of the New Testament. In Jeremiah 31, God prophesied he would eventually make a new covenant, a New Testament. This New Testament, of which Paul was a minister, he says, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter kills, the Spirit gives life. He said, now the administration of death, which was written and engraved in stone, That's the way God inscribed the Ten Commandments. Later on, in Deuteronomy 27, a whole portion of a mountainside was plastered, and a portion of the law was inscribed there that people might read it. It involved an external, and that was the blessings and cursings there of Deuteronomy 27. You might go back and read that there on Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, the blessings and the cursings. And there was inscribed there what would happen if you broke certain things. Now, this was the administration of death, written and engraved in stone, and it was glorious. Yes, it was. So much that Moses, coming down the mountain with all of this, so manifested glory, because after all, it was of divine origin, and God's presence was there. And so much so, the children of Israel couldn't even look at his face. But that glory was done away. The shine on Moses' face faded. Now, if the administration of death, if the letter of the law involved a glory that was impressive, and yet that glory, symbolized by the glory that was displayed by Moses, if that glory faded, how much more glorious, Paul says, is a glory that will never fade. If that, verse 11, if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remains is glorious. God said He was going to make a new covenant to replace the old. Now, He talked here in verse 13 about Moses who put a veil over his face. The children of Israel couldn't look at him, and yet that faded. But then Paul goes on and he draws an example from that, and he says, their minds were blinded. And until this day, there remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. He said, just as they couldn't look at Moses after he had been in the presence of God, just as they were unable to look at him straight on, and he had to veil his face. He says, in the same way, they never were able to really look at the real intent of the Old Testament. They never got the point. Until this day, the same veil is untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. They don't get the point. They don't grasp the intent. The word spirit in both the Hebrew and the Greek language comes from a root word which means wind or breath. And there are various aspects of it, but one aspect of the word spirit is the animating or life-giving quality. That quality that animates, that gives life. Just as the breath is the source of physical life, God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and Adam became a living soul. There is a living law. God's law is not simply an external code written down somewhere. It is a living law. Now, the point Paul brings out here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is that the Jews who have not been called of God, who have not yet come to Christ, don't get the point. It's not enough simply to be a scholar. It's not enough simply to know Greek or to know Hebrew. there are various ones who have focused on that. There were different ones back years ago that took exception to certain things Mr. Armstrong would say. They say, well, Mr. Armstrong's not a scholar. He doesn't read Greek and Hebrew. That's right. He didn't. I'll tell you what, though, the land of Greece is filled with people that read Greek. Everybody there reads Greek if they read. And if they read the New Testament, they read it in Greek. How many of them are in the church? How many of them understand what it means? The land of Israel is filled with Jews that speak Hebrew. And if they read the Old Testament, they read it in Hebrew. How many of them get the point? The Pharisees of Jesus' day wrote and read and spoke Hebrew probably better than any scholar alive today. Biblical Hebrew. How many of them really got the point of what the Old Testament meant? I'm not knocking the technical knowledge of the language of Greek or Hebrew, but I'm simply saying that it takes far more than that to understand the Bible. There are those who can simply get involved in what the Apostle Paul talks about, ever learning and never able to come to a knowledge of the truth, striving after words, and never getting the point. Now, it talks here, see, even unto this day when Moses is read, the veil's upon their heart. When it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. When they come to a knowledge of the Lord, when they come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. See, then you can get the point. Because in reality, the old points to the new. The Spirit of the law is that animating quality of the law. It is the underlying animating principles that underlie the real intent and purpose of the law of God. It is not sufficient simply to observe every literal point, every letter. There are those who can go through and follow every letter and never get the point. We're going to see some examples of that. We're going to see some examples of what really is the spirit of the law. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 6 we're told, now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit, not in oldness of letter. Now what does it mean we're delivered from the law? There are those saying, well, see, that proves 10 commandments are done away. We're delivered from the law. Well, if that's so, that means you can go out and steal and rob and murder and pillage and commit adultery and bow down to idols and just do all of those things and lie and cheat. We're delivered from the law. Go and explain that to your local sheriff. I'm delivered from the law. You might find out that he's not real impressed. Now, what does it mean we're delivered from the law? We're delivered from the penalty of the law. We're delivered from what the law exacts. Because when you break the law, that's a sin. Sin is the transgression of the law. The wages of sin is death. Jesus Christ died in our stead. We are delivered from the law, being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit, not in the oldness of letter. We've been given, when we become a Christian, when we accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in our stead, we're given a new lease on life. Maybe you've never thought of it that way, but you were as good as dead. You were under a death sentence. You were on death row. Maybe you never thought of yourself as being on death row, but you were on death row. You were awaiting the execution date. Here came along a chance for a full reprieve, full pardon. You're given a new lease on life. You're ready to be turned loose and to have a new lease on life. You see, Paul said in Galatians, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. We're given a new lease on life. We're turned loose. Given a new lease on life. For what purpose? Not to go back and simply serve in the oldness of the letter, but to serve in newness of spirit. Let's go to the book of Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2. Pick it up in verse 17. Behold, you are called a Jew, and rest in the law, and make your boast of God. And you know his will, and approve the things that are most excellent, being instructed out of the law. You're confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind, a light of them that are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which have a form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. So here was the attitude many of the Jews had. They were pretty proud of themselves. You, therefore, which teach another, why don't you teach yourself? You that preach that a man should not steal, what about you? You steal, you cut some corners. You that say a man should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you commit sacrilege? You that make your boast of the law through breaking the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. Paul really blasts them. He says, you are proud of your possession of the law. And yet, frankly, you've given the law a bad reputation. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of your lousy example, Paul told them. Then in verse 25, circumcision truly profits if you keep the law. But if you be a breaker of the law, your circumcision is made uncircumcision. Your identifying sign of the covenant that identifies you as a part of the covenant people is as good as done away. If you're not obeying, if you're not keeping the law, then you're not part of the covenant people no matter what outward physical sign you may have. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge you, who by the letter and circumcision do transgress the law? Now, he says, look, what if Paul is writing here to the church at Rome, and the church at Rome consisted of both Jews and Gentiles. And they each had things they were proud of. The Jews were proud and looked down on the Gentiles because, after all, we are the possessors of the law. We know the law. And that puts us one up on those Gentiles. Now, the Gentiles had other things they were proud of. They were proud of their Greek and Roman heritage, of their great culture. See, the Greeks figured they were superior because, after all, they were the purveyors of education and culture to the world. The Romans knew they were because they ruled the world. The Jews figured they were because they were on, they had a special in with God. They were the covenant people and had the sign of the covenant God had made with Abraham, and so they knew that they were one up on everybody else. So everybody had his claim to fame. And Paul is here. He blasted the Gentiles a little earlier, but now he's blasting the Jews. And he said, look, now you think that you're really one up because you have the sign of the covenant. You're circumcised. He said, what about someone who's uncircumcised? Let's say a Gentile Roman who's not circumcised, who keeps the law, who does what the law says, who fulfills the intent of the law. Don't you think that he is going to judge you, who by the letter and circumcision do transgress the law? Oh, you may be following certain rules and external regulations, but in principle and in practice, you're breaking the law. He is not a Jew which is one outwardly. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. He's a Jew which is one inwardly. Circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit and not in the letter. whose praise is not of men, but of God. Circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter. What God is after is not simply external conformity. He is after an internalization, a transformation, an inward renewal. It is not sufficient simply to externally conform. Now let's go back. We get some principles here to understand the spirit of the law. Let's go through some specifics and see how these principles are further explained. Let's go back to the Sermon on the Mount. Because just as the statutes and judgments that Moses gave in Exodus 21, 22, and 23 represented the application of the Ten Commandments to a physical nation. The statements Jesus made in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 represented the application of the principles of the Ten Commandments to a spiritual nation. These are the statutes and judgments for the church, if you will. These are the applications of the principles of the law. Now, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, Jesus said, "Think not that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Jesus did not come to do away with the law. The law is going to endure. He said, "Until heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle is anywise going to pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Whoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and teach men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever will do and teach them, the same will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So Christ did not come saying that it's okay to disregard the law. And even some of the, quote, little things are important. But notice what he said in verse 20. He says, "I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now what does that mean? Unless your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Did Christ mean that his disciples needed to keep the Sabbath more meticulously? They needed to tithe more scrupulously? They needed to be more filled with care and zeal in their avoidance of unclean foods? Is that what he meant? That the Pharisees were careless in those things? No. The Pharisees were very, very careful in those areas. Anything that involved external application. In fact, the Pharisees had drawn up a whole set of rules. Now, what they claimed to have done was to have hedged about the law. They said that the oral tradition was a hedge about the law. See, they knew they'd gotten in trouble and gone into captivity for breaking the law, so they said, you know what we need to do is to build a hedge around the law. We need to go further than what the law requires and come up with this arbitrary list of rules that we know that if we do those, then the law is safe inside. See, the law requires certain things, but we will require more than the law requires. We'll build a hedge around the law. And therefore, we'll be safe. And so they trusted in their scrupulous observance of man-made rules, which degenerated down into a very hypocritical approach. Jesus Christ indicted them primarily for their hypocrisy. They focused in on certain components of the law and were very scrupulous and meticulous in those areas. But they never got the point. They never got the point. They didn't grasp the spirit of the law. Now, what is the spirit of the law? Well, notice Jesus then explains what is the spirit of the law and what this means. What about the commandment, thou shalt not kill? This is the one Jesus started with in explaining the spirit of the law. Verse 21, you have heard that it has been said by them of old time, you shall not kill. He's quoting, of course, from the Ten Commandments. Whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. Now, you've heard that. That's the law. That's the letter of the law. Does that mean you can do anything short of murder? Well, that was the way the Pharisees understood it. It said, you shall not kill. It didn't say you can't torture within an inch of life. It just said you can't kill. I mean, isn't that what it said? It didn't say you couldn't beat the fire out of them. It just said, don't kill them. So you stop. They were very, very meticulous on things. You've heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not kill. Whoever shall kill will be in danger of the judgment. I say unto you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever shall say unto his brother, Raka, a very derisive term, a very contemptible or derisive term, shall be in danger of the council. And whoever shall say, you fool, have just an attitude of contempt for another human being, shall be in danger of hellfire. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has aught against you, leave your gift before the altar, go your way, first be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're in the way. Christ went on and he expounded the principle, the spirit of the law. It's not enough simply to refrain from picking up a gun and blowing somebody's brains out. Christ said, what is the intent? What is the spirit of murder and violence? It is an attitude of hate, an attitude of contempt, an attitude of unbridled anger and resentment. It is an attitude of strife and argument. This is the basis of what leads to murder. Christ said it's not enough simply to keep the letter. The whole point was to avoid and to get away from the attitudes that lead to murder. Whether they be unbridled anger or resentment, attitudes of contempt, the attitudes of argument and strife, the spirit of violence as opposed to the spirit of peace. Peace is more than simply the absence of war. The obedience to the sixth commandment is more than simply avoiding picking up a gun and shooting someone. So Jesus began to explain the spirit of the law. What did he mean? You have to go beyond. This is the spirit of the law as contrasted with the letter. The spirit goes beyond the letter. It is what underlies the letter. It is the real intent. It is the animating quality of the law. Verse 27, he takes another of the Ten Commandments. You have heard that it has been said by them of old time, you shall not commit adultery. I say unto you, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. Now, Christ said, the law says you shall not commit adultery. Is that what it means? Anything up to the completion of the full physical act of adultery, anything up to that is okay? It's just you got to, stop just barely short of the actual completion of that act. Christ said, a lot more is intended. God, faithfulness begins in the heart and in the mind. It's not enough simply to refrain from physically following through. The whole point, the spirit, the intent of the law is faithfulness. Faithfulness. And that starts in the heart and in the mind. He went on and he said, verse 31, Takes a different point. Now, the first two, he pulled directly out of the Ten Commandments. Now, he goes to other principles of the law, found elsewhere in the first 5 books of the Bible, because what he's doing is he picks out certain points to illustrate. He is illustrating the spirit of the law, and he picks out individual principles, and he illustrates the spirit. It has been said, verse 31, whosoever shall put away his wife shall give her a writing of divorcement. I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except for the cause of fornication, of gross immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. Now, many of the Jews of Christ's day were bogged down in various arguments over divorce. You know, they came to Jesus trying to tempt him. We read later on in the book of Matthew, came to him trying to tempt him, to get him entangled as to what exactly were the causes for which a man could put away his wife. You see, their whole perspective was wrong. They were looking for a way out. They were looking, how do we get out of this? You know, looking for loopholes. They had a lawyer's mentality. Jesus told them, you know, we can read it back in Matthew 19, where the Pharisees in verse 3 came to him tempting, saying, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Jesus answered and said, have you not read, he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one? Christ got back to the spirit, to the intent. What was God's purpose? It's, you know, you fellows looking for the wrong thing. You're looking how to get out. You need to be looking how to, instead of looking how to get away, you need to be looking for how to make it work. You need to be looking as to what does God desire. See, instead of asking the question, how much can I get by with, the question we ought to ask is, what would God be most pleased with? What would be most pleasing in the sight of God? What could I do that God would like the best? Not, now, will I get kicked out of the church if I do this or not? See, that's what I want to know. Will I get kicked out of the church? That's the wrong question. That's the wrong question. Because if that's your attitude as you go through life, you may avoid getting, quote, kicked out of the church. You may warm a seat all the way up to the lake of fire. You know, it's going to fat a lot of good it's going to do you. We're not playing games. We're not here to impress one another. The whole point is not whether I think you're this or you think someone is that. The question is, we're to be living our lives before God. To be living our lives before God. The question is not, how much can I get by with? The question needs to be, how much can I be like God? How much can I reflect the mind of Christ? So, Christ then dealt with the issue of divorce here in the spirit of the law in regards to marriage, to faithfulness and commitment. This is the spirit of the law, the intent of the law. The intent of the law dealing with marriage and divorce, the spirit and intent of the law is faithfulness and commitment. The hard times as well as the good times. Not looking for an easy way out. That's not God. That was never God's desire or intent. Verse 33, Christ went on to something else. You have heard, it's been said by them of old time, you shall not forswear yourself. You shall perform to the Lord all your oaths. If you swear it, you do it. Christ said, but I say unto you, don't swear at all. Don't swear by heaven or by earth or anything else. You by your swearing are not going to make anything, you're not going to change anything by swearing. Let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay. Whatever is more than these comes of evil. The whole point of swearing is you're making a distinction in what you're saying. This time I'm really telling the truth. And I'm telling the truth because I'm putting my hand on the Bible and I'm raising my hand or sticking up my foot or doing whatever I'm doing. I'm really telling the truth this time. Christ said, look, the whole point, the spirit of the law, just tell the truth, period. If you always tell the truth, and your yes always means yes, and your no always means no, then there's no point in ever swearing to anything. Because when you start swearing to things, the whole point, what you're doing is you're making a distinction. You're saying, you really count on I'm telling the truth this time. I don't usually tell the truth, but this time I am. Because I could be guilty of perjury, they might send me off to jail, so I'll tell the truth this time. Christ said the spirit of the law, in terms of this, was not to come up with some elaborately contrived oath. You see, the Pharisees had gone through and they had drawn up various oaths that were more or less binding, and which oath was more binding than which other oath. And they had a whole hierarchy of oaths as to which oaths were more binding than other oaths. Ridiculous. You missed the whole point. Christ said the point is, tell the truth. That's the spirit of the law. Let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. And if you do that all the time, consistently, then it's not a problem. You don't need to use any oath. Then, verse 38, picked another principle. You've heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say unto you, don't resist evil. Whoever will smite you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If a man's going to, the point here has to do with retaliation, with vengeance. Now the principle, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, was given in the statutes back in Exodus 21. What it had to do with, in the context back there, was the fact that in civil law, the punishment should fit the crime. That was what it meant, that the punishment should fit the crime. But some had come to apply it in some sort of a personal way, that I'm going to get even. You do something to me, I'm going to get back with you. And Christ said, the spirit of the law, the real intent, does not allow for personal vengeance and retaliation. It involves a spirit of giving. It says, verse 42, give to him that asks you. Now, it didn't say you give him everything he asks. Sometimes people may ask something that's not for their benefit, or that's not in your reasonable power to give, or that you shouldn't give. But it says, give to him that asks. Have a giving approach, and an attitude and a spirit of trying to help and to give and to share. Be willing to come out on the bottom end. Be willing to trust God. You see, the whole point of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Let God take care of evening the score. Let God fight your battles. Let God even the score. You don't have to get in there and slug it out. Oh, I'm not going to let anybody get by with anything from me. Let God even the score. Let God even it up. Verse 43, we'll notice one other point Christ brought out. You've heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, the law said in the Old Testament, back in Deuteronomy 23, verse 6, you shall love your neighbor. The Jews figured, well, it didn't say anything about enemies, so if you're to love your neighbor, then obviously you must be supposed to hate your enemies. Now, they got into great elaborate arguments over who is your neighbor. You remember one of the scribes came to him and said, asked him, well, what is the great commandment of the law? And he said, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So the scribe said, well, that's right. I agree with that. But you know, what I want to know is who is my neighbor? Now the Pharisees had great, lengthy discussions about who is my neighbor. They never got the point. They were so busy bogged down figuring how far somebody had to live from you to still be your neighbor, that they didn't get the point. And Christ went through and he told them a story. He told them an example. He says, you know, here was a man going down to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, and they robbed him, beat him up, left him there on the side of the road. Priest came walking by, looked over, saw the guy, walked on by. Went around, got on the other side of the road, didn't want to get close, didn't want to be defiled. Levite came by. He did the same thing. Finally, a Samaritan came by. Now, the Jews looked down on the Samaritans. The Samaritans had an off-brand, kind of a mixture of pagan religion, Babylonian religion stuck in with an overlay of the Bible. They were looked down upon from a variety of standpoints. The Jews despised the Samaritans. So Christ could not have picked, a worse fellow to have come by. So first the priest came by, then the Levite came by, now the Samaritan came by, and he saw the fellow. And said he had compassion on him. And he went over there and he checked, and the guy was still alive, and he cleaned him up, and he washed his wounds and put a little wine on there, which of course is an anesthetic, a disinfectant. Put some oil on there, probably some olive oil, to soothe the wounds. Salve. Managed him up, took him to an inn, and made arrangements with the owner of the inn to let the fellow stay there and recuperate, and said, look, if, whatever you're out, he says, I'll take care of it when I come back. Now, I said, which one of these three was a neighbor to him that was hurt? Well, obviously, the Samaritan. Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is whomever you come in contact with. Whoever you meet, whoever with whom you come in contact. Jesus said, look, the spirit of the law is love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you. Don't have this attitude of I'll be nice to my friends and my family, and I'll look down on and despise everybody else. He says, verse 46, if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Even the publicans do the same. You salute your brethren only. What do you more than others? Big deal. You're nice to your friends. That puts you in the same category as anybody else in the world. Most people like those that like them. Christ expects something more. You see, there is a motivating, animating, underlying quality that is the underlying intent of the law. The Pharisees missed the point because they got so bogged down in worrying about some technical aspect that they missed the whole point of what God was driving at. They never got the point. They never got the point. Christ here gives the key. Now let's go back to Luke chapter 6. In Luke chapter 6, came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, or the second Sabbath first rank, this would be the last holy day of unleavened bread, he was going through the cornfields. And his disciples plucked the ears of corn and ate, rubbing them with their hands. Certainly the Pharisees said unto him, why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? Now what they had to do, as I mentioned last week, was they were accusing them of threshing and harvesting. See, they missed the point. Jeremiah had talked in the Old Testament, had really chewed the Jews out for bringing in burdens on the Sabbath day, hauling in agricultural produce to Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And it told them not to be bringing in burdens on the Sabbath, not to be hauling this produce in. So they, instead of understanding the spirit and the intent, they got into a debate as to what constituted a burden. And finally brought it down to consist of 3 dried figs. They missed the whole point. So they were all upset. They said, "You're doing that which is not lawful." Jesus said, "Haven't you read? Have you not read so much as this, what David did when he was hungry? And those that were with him, how he went into the house of God, did take and eat of the showbread, gave also to those that were with him, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priest alone." And he said unto them that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, the account that he gave here of David that we read back in Samuel, back in 1 Samuel, when David was fleeing from Saul, and he came there to where the priests were at Nob, and where the tabernacle was pitched. And of course, in the tabernacle, in the holy place, every week there were 12 unleavened loaves that were put on display, that were shown or presented in the presence of God, and they were there in the tabernacle for a week. Then they were taken out, and at the end of that time, they were to be utilized by the priests. They were not something that, because of having been associated with the presence of God, they were to be treated with respect and were reserved for the priest. But David came along, he and his men, they were hungry. The priest didn't have anything except that there to give them. He was in a hurry. And so they let him and his men eat the bread. Now, the Pharisees had a problem with that. And because they never got the spirit, they never got the intent. The intent of God's law had to do with showing respect and reverence for that which is associated with God's presence, not treating it lightly or casually. But there's a little room for some reason and some common sense. Now, Christ and the disciples came on this little footpath and reached out and plucked a few of the ears of grain off and were chewing the wheat berries. They weren't harvesting the field. They weren't threshing the field. But the Pharisees missed the point. They missed the intent. We could go on. We see others here in terms of the Sabbath, how they came looking for an accusation. On back in Luke chapter 13, verse 10, he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman that had a spirit of infirmity, 18 years. She was all bent over, crippled up, and could not straighten up. And Christ told her, he healed her. He said, "Woman, you're loosed from your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and she immediately was healed. Now the ruler of the synagogue, verse 14 of Luke 13, answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. He was indignant. But he would have healed this woman of her infirmity on the Sabbath. And the Lord answered, verse 15, he said, "You hypocrite! You hypocrite! Do not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to water him? You got an ox or an ass tied up there in the barn in a stall. Don't you go out on the Sabbath and loose the thing, the poor dumb creature, and go out and lead it over and let it get some water? Now, ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath?" You don't get the point. You can get all bent out of shape on something and totally miss the point. When he said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed. You see, Christ utilized examples and opportunities to teach the spirit of the law. In the Sermon on the Mount, he illustrated certain principles, and he picked certain key principles from different portions of the law, and he illustrated what is the spirit, the intent, the underlying quality. He did the same by example on the Sabbath. It was in teaching the spirit of the law relating to the Sabbath, he taught by example and illustration. Now let's notice another aspect of the spirit of the law. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Here's another aspect of the spirit of the law, one that perhaps is not as clearly understood or realized. But this is also one aspect of the spirit of the law. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 9. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. This is quoted from Deuteronomy 25:4. Does God take care for oxen? Or says he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt this is written, that he which plows should plow in hope, and he that threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we reap your carnal things? Now, Paul is here talking about the right of the ministry to receive a livelihood from the tithes and offerings of the people. And he quotes this verse from Deuteronomy 25:4, don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. And he said, now let me ask you, what does that mean? Do you think the entire meaning of that is the fact that the whole reason God put that in the Bible was simply to make sure that oxen were fed? You think is that the only thing you get out of that verse? That oxen ought to be fed? And if it is, well then, you see, all you're doing is getting the letter and not the spirit. There is an underlying principle. The ox is the one who's doing the work. He's treading out the grain. And so there's a principle of fairness there. And so if it applies even to an ox, even to a dumb animal, a creature that God has created, certainly it applies far more so on the human level and the spiritual level. You know, those that plow should plow in hope. You don't just plow for the fun of plowing. You plow because you're wanting a crop. He that threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. You plow and you harvest, you thresh, you want a crop. You're going to reap a harvest. So he says, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we reap your physical things? Now, here's another aspect of the spirit of the law. That is being able to recognize and to understand that there are spiritual principles that derive from statements in the law. You see, some want to bog down and say, well, now there's no place in the Bible that it says, thou shalt not do thus and so. There are a lot of things that are not spelled out in exactly those kinds of words. There are many things that are. But God did not just compile a list. You know, He could have just given a list of rules. 5,978 rules. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, thou shalt do this. And He could have given every minute detail. Just a list of rules. Something comes up, this is rule 738. This is rule 5001. This is rule number 73. Everything covered by a specific rule. All you had to do was externally conform to this or that rule. The Pharisees had tried to develop that. They missed the point. Paul talked about the fact that there is an underlying principle. There is a lesson to be learned, even sometimes from things that may relate to a different matter, but there's an underlying principle. Here, the underlying principle was principle of fairness, principle that the one that does the work ought to get something out of it. That's a principle. That's an underlying motivating factor, and it applies right on down to the animals. But it would certainly turn around. Paul told the Corinthians, he said, now if if that's in the law and that principle is going to be applied to the animals, you think that it's unfair, because some in Corinth had been accusing Paul and making statements about Paul. They were very selfish in their approach. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we find some more. 1 Corinthians 10:1, he says, moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, did all eat the same spiritual meat, did all drink the same spiritual drink. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. With many of them God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. These things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. Neither be idolaters, as were some of them. And he goes on, and down in verse 11, he says, now all these things happened unto them for examples. They're written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. You see, Paul goes through and he makes reference to the event primarily recorded in the book of Numbers, the events of the church in the wilderness, being called out of Egypt and the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, and the ups and downs and the things that they went through. And Paul then focuses, he says, there's a spirit of the law there. You see, the things they went through, it's not simply a matter of old dead history. Ah, yes, those people back then, they did this, or they did that. Yes, they did this other. There is a principle. The spirit of the law, when you study the examples in the Old Testament, because most of the Old Testament is filled with testimonies, filled with examples and illustrations which testify of God's working in human events. One of the primary ways that we need to study it is not simply as some old dead historical account, but as something that contains living principles. It contains examples and illustrations of what people did, of how they responded, of how God responded to their response. There are things that we are to learn and derive from it. The way to study these things are written down for our admonition. They're examples for us. The reason God preserved this record is so that we might learn from it. We will find ourselves in similar circumstances. The details will be different, but the principle remains the same. The principle remains the same. And they don't get the point. You see, we have to study the Bible with a grasp of the spirit of the law. So this is another aspect of the spirit of the law. The principles that are derived from the illustrations and examples in the Old Testament. Now, there are of course many things in the New Testament that relate to one. Let me give you one example, one illustration, back in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9. Now let's look here a little bit at the spirit of the law. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9, Paul is exhorting Timothy as to the way that the church is to be admonished and instructed in various matters. And in verse 8, he talks about men praying everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Now, what does it mean to lift up holy hands? As you lift up your hands to God. Holy hands means that your hands have not been involved in all sorts of sin. You can't be, your hands are the means by which you do and act. They're the means of action. You can't be stealing and killing and doing things that are wrong and then go through great pretense of prayer to God. You can't hold up guilty hands. Not unless you're at the point of repenting and turning from that, where God removes the guilt. And then he says, in like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Now, let me ask you something. What is modest apparel? What is modest apparel? You know, the Bible does not exactly define let me give you an example. The various styles have existed over a period of years. God nowhere in the Scriptures defines exactly one particular style for all time. You know what would have been considered immodest apparel back in the 1800s would stand out as pretty modest today. You know, and if you look, the normal custom practice in the 1800s, the women wore clothes, the skirts of which normally came to the ground or very close to it. If you had worn a skirt that came up to your knees, it would have attracted quite a bit of attention because you would have been the only one on the street that looked like that. That would have, everybody would have been turning and looking. Now, there's no place in the Bible where God said, it has to be an inch from the ground or X number of inches from the ground or from the knee or from anything else. He gave a principle here. He said modest apparel. Now, there's a certain range for variation depending on the time and the culture, the society. You see, God did not break things down into, in certain areas, there is a certain range of flexibility. But there is an underlying principle that always remains the same. And there's some things that are never going to be modest in any society or any culture. Because they attract undue attention. In a wrong way. You know, if back in the late 60s and early 70s, the mini skirts came in. And, they got shorter and shorter, and the micro minis and all of the various things that came around. And the issue came up in terms of what constituted modest apparel. And there were some rulings that we got into at the time in terms of drawing a specific limit and saying, thus far and no further. Now, it's not that the skirt length that was prescribed didn't constitute modesty, but the point was that there is a more important principle that is involved. You see, God's principle has to do with a mindset. And the way we think is going to be reflected in the way we act. Now, there are those who might, if we were to draw a specific rule and say X number of inches, they get out the measuring tape and they measure and they make sure it comes right to the spot. All they've done is externally conform to something, but there's no set of the mind to modesty. It's simply an external conformity to a rule. God is after something far more than an external conformity. He is after a way of thinking that is going to reflect itself in what we do outwardly, because what we do outwardly ultimately reflects what we are on the inside, the way we think. It reflects our values and our priorities. Obviously, somebody wears a skirt hike way up above the knee that's so tight that every time they walk, they wiggle and waggle back and forth, and every time they go by, all the men turn and look. That's not really modest apparel. I don't think but how tight is too tight? How short is too short? Or if you, back a while ago, the slit came in. And so you could walk by, and it was now you see, now you don't, back and forth, peekaboo. Now, is that modest apparel? Or kind of turn and look, watch him take a step and see. Well, how much what about a half an inch? Is that, that wouldn't be a problem, would it? Just a little slit? What about an inch? What about an inch and a half? See, is there a specific length? How high can a slit be before, how much of a slit can you have before it becomes immodest? See, that misses the whole point. What is being discussed is a mindset. The spirit of the law is a mindset that will reflect itself in what we do externally. Instead of getting bogged down worrying about how far can I go, let me get a specific rule to externally conform to, define it in terms of inches. There's a principle. God gave a principle. That involves the spirit of the law, because the spirit of the law is a set of mind. It's a way of thinking, which will reflect itself in what we do. And it's crucial to understand. Now let's just notice one final thing in terms of the spirit of the law. You see, the spirit of the law is more than simply the absence of direct evil. The spirit of the law is more than simply the absence of direct evil. It is the presence of positive good. Notice in Ephesians, let's notice 2 or 3 examples here. Ephesians 4:28. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather, instead of stealing, let him work, let him labor, working with his hands, the thing that's good that he may have to give to him that needs. Now, the spirit of the law is not simply that you no longer steal. Okay, I've quit robbing. Don't rob 7-Elevens anymore. Makes me really something great, huh? Paul says it's not enough simply to refrain from going out and stealing and robbing. He says the spirit of the law, the motivating principle, is not simply the abstinence from taking and stealing what doesn't belong to you, but being a productive person. Accomplish something, do something, be a productive person. Get a job, go to work, be a productive part of the community. Do something of value so that you can help and give to someone else if they're in need. It's not enough simply to refrain from taking away from someone what's theirs. The principle, the spirit of the law, is you replace that negative, you avoid that negative by replacing it with something positive. There is a positive side. That's the spirit of the law. He says in verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. No dirty, rotten speech. Don't be standing around telling dirty jokes. That's one thing that's part of what corrupt communication means. You know, our society has gotten very lax. There was a time, the term locker room humor. Some of you know what is meant by that. The concept was that there were things that were said, in all male settings that would certainly not be repeated in mixed company. That distinction has since been lost because it's incredible, the things that you'll sometimes hear, men and women standing around together. He said, let no corrupt communication, no rotten speech proceed out of your mouth. But it's not enough simply to refrain from saying a bunch of dirty, rotten things. But it's not just zip your lip and never say another word. Well, can't talk dirty, guess won't talk. That's not what he says. He says, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. Say something that's going to build up, that's going to help. Say something of value. Say something that has a gracious quality to it. Something that has substance, that has value. The spirit of the law of avoiding corrupt speech is have good speech. Say things that are worthwhile, things that are upbuilding, that are valuable, things that are going to be helpful and encouraging, things that are positive. Focus in on things that build up, not things that tear down. He said, verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Get rid of those things. How do you do it? Being kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, forgives you. See, how do you get rid of the negative? Replace it with a positive. That's the spirit of the law. You get rid of the negatives by replacing it with a positive. God does not simply want us to have a void and a vacuum in our lives. Well, I don't do this anymore, and I quit doing that, and I quit doing this other. That's all well and good, but what are you doing? It's not just the things we've quit doing, it's the things we should have started doing. Because the spirit of the law, the enduring quality, that this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will write my law into their hearts and into their minds. The law of God written with the Spirit of God in our innermost being. The transformation of the way we are, the way we think and feel. Or as the Apostle Paul brings out in the book of Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. That is the spirit of the law.